Welcome everyone to the second installment of our virtual lecture series called Conservation Stories. My name is Kristen Barker. I'm the Community Education Coordinator here at the Garden. And I'm happy to once again be joined by Naomi Fraga, who is the Director of Conservation Programs here. If you joined us last month, you may recognize Naomi as the speaker. And last time she discussed some of the conservation work that she does in the San Bernardino Mountains and the endemic species there. So it was a wonderful discussion, and I'm happy to have her back again this month, and this time in the role of moderator. So thank you, Naomi, again for being here tonight. And our speaker for the evening is Sophie Winitsky. Sophie was a graduate student here at CalBG and has moved on to getting her PhD at Montana State University. And so she'll be discussing some of her work that she did as a student in the Adobe Valley. And so before I hand it over to them, I just want to encourage you all to use the chat and Q&A features of the webinar. We'll be able to kind of pause periodically throughout the presentation to address a few of those questions that you might have, but we will have a dedicated Q&A segment at the end of the presentation. So I encourage you all to stick around for that as well. And before we get into our talk tonight, I just wanted to announce that the last of our lecture series is going to be next month on November 17th with current graduate student Maria Jesus, and she'll be discussing her conservation work in the conglomerate mesa in the southern Inyo Mountains. So we'd love to have you all joining us then as well. And so with that, I would just like to hand you over to Naomi. Naomi, thank you again for being here with us tonight.
Thanks, Kristen. I'm really glad to be here today to introduce Sophie Winitsky. And I'll also be excited next week when I'm here also to join with Maria on her talk for Conglomerate Mesa, which is a very topical issue. So definitely join in for that. So as Kristen mentioned, Sophie is no stranger to California Botanic Garden. She was a graduate student in our program. She graduated in 2019, where she did a master's degree in doing a floristic study in the Adobe Valley, which she'll be talking with you about today. Just a little side note, I'm really excited to see Sophie's talk this evening for a number of reasons, but Sophie was my very first student that I mentored here at California Botanic Garden. And so I spent quite some time with her in the field exploring this really wonderful place. So I know you're going to really enjoy getting to know the Adobe Valley. It's really spectacular. And so Sophie will have many great stories to share with you. Sophie has had a very accomplished botanical career, and she's still budding in her botanical career, and it will only continue to grow. But after graduating from the California Botanic Garden, Sophie went on to work with the California Native Plant Society as an assistant vegetation ecologist. And then following that, she worked as a public programs coordinator with the Jepson Herbarium at UC Berkeley. I know that Sophie had really great experiences with those organizations, but she also had a yearning to return to research. So it's really exciting that Sophie's now embarking on a PhD program at Montana State University, where she's going to be studying systematics and evolution of the genus Marina, which is in the legume family Fabaceae, a really wonderfully diverse genus with many, many narrow endemics. And so I think that really extends from Sophie's interest in plant conservation. I'm really excited to see Sophie's presentation this evening. I know she'll share her love for plants and conservation as she talks about the Adobe Valley flora. Thanks, Sophie.
Thanks, Naomi. Thanks for having me. And I'm really excited that California Botanic Garden is putting on this conservation lecture series, especially during a time when we're all separated, and it's a way to sort of come together around the things that are happening in our state and stay involved with them. So tonight I'm going to be talking about the Adobe Valley flora and documenting California's endangered alkali wetlands. So let me turn my mouse. So the theme of tonight's talk is going to be botany's role. So botanical collections, botanists, and botanical inventories role in conservation. So why do we need to have this baseline data? And I'm going to go through two different projects. So the first one is place-based conservation, and I'll talk about my floristic inventory that documented the rare communities of Adobe Valley. And then the second part of the talk is going to be focused on a single species, which also exists in Adobe Valley, and this is Calochortus excavatus, a rare star tulip. So first of all, I can't see everybody out there, so I don't know how much you know about floristic research, but a flora is a comprehensive inventory of a region. And so for this flora, I tried to document every single species. There's no way to know that you documented every single species, but I tried my hardest of the area, Adobe Valley and the Adobe Hills. And I did this by collecting herbarium vouchers. So by having an actual physical specimen, that provides a record of biodiversity that is incredibly important in our field. I use those now doing a systematics project. I can't go travel around in the field right now. And so I'm able to, off of herbarium specimens, extract DNA and look at the plant's DNA without going into the field. So that's one way we use herbarium specimens. Also, if someone was to look at my inventory in 100 years and say, was there really an alkali meadow there? Does that plant really exist? They would be able to go to herbarium and check for themselves that that plant was documented there. So I do also love taking pictures of plants and using iNaturalist, but this is a different type of record. And floristic inventories are also foundational for later research. Things are changing really quickly, especially in the area that I'm going to be talking about. So if we have sort of a time capsule of what existed in that area at a certain time, we can look at change, climate change, or other changes over time. Also, it's very important to document the distribution of plants when we're making conservation decisions. So in California, we have a lot of botanists, a lot of people, also a lot of biodiversity. So there's tons of botanical data. So why did I choose to do a floristic inventory in California? Well, even though we do have a lot of documentation and we are able to ask a lot of ecological questions because of that, there are also botanical black holes. So places that are consistently overlooked, especially in the desert where there hasn't been as much development, we don't have as much data. So I tried to find one of those when I was deciding where to do my research. And also just when you decide to do a flora of an area, you really don't have any idea what you're going to find. And so you do come across all types of surprising discoveries along the way. So where is the area that I'm going to bring us to tonight? Where is Adobe Valley?
Sophie, I'm wondering before you launch into this, if you can give us a little bit of background. So you mentioned botanical black holes, and that might be one reason why you chose Adobe Valley. But if you can also give us some background as to if there was something that particularly drew you to this area and why you, other reasons why you chose to work here.
Yeah, definitely. So one reason is that I'm from Los Angeles and I grew up in Los Angeles, and then I began my botanical career in Eastern California. And so often the issue of water came up, and I learned a lot about where my water comes from as a Los Angeles resident after moving out to Bishop and seeing the LA aqueduct and seeing its impacts on the flora. So the area that I decided to study was north of the aqueduct, and it's in this boundary here, and you can see this white area. These are these alkali marshes and meadows. So compared to the alkali marshes and meadows in Eastern California, farther south, they're relatively intact and pristine compared to the ones farther south. So it was an area that I could study what alkali marshes and meadows would look like before the aqueduct and before Los Angeles was built. And so that kind of tied into why I wanted to ask those particular questions. But also the reality of it was that I went on a road trip by myself, driving around California. And when I drove into the Adobe Valley, I just had already decided that I was going to work there. So there were both intellectual and emotional reasons for choosing Adobe Valley. And it's in Mono County, which is this red county here. And it's in the northeastern part of the county. And so to orient you, here is Mono Lake, and here is Yosemite, just to the west of that. And then the Sierras farther go north-south there. And then we drop off into Owens Valley, and here are the White Mountains. So Adobe Valley is one of those places that is surrounded by very botanically interesting areas and was overlooked in the past by botanists. And as you can see, there's like hills surrounding the study area. And these hills gather snow in the winter, and as the snow melts, the water resurfaces on the lowest area, about 6,200 feet here on the northeastern side of the valley. And so that creates those wetland communities. And these wetland communities are a lot more common throughout the Great Basin. And they are just in California on the eastern edge. So if we look at the floristic provinces of California, this image is from the Jepson, which was the taxonomic manual that was the authority for the taxonomy for this project. So that's the book that I use that has all of the species in California. And I use their nomenclature. So the Great Basin Floristic Province comes into California in two different places, the Modoc Plateau up here in northeastern California, and then also in the Sierra Nevada East. So floristically, the Great Basin is described by having sagebrush scrub in the lower areas and then juniper pinyon uplands. And the boundaries floristically are here with the Mojave Desert, and that's where the sagebrush becomes creosote, and here with the Sierra Nevada, and the Sierra Nevada on that east side is a very steep granite ridge, basically, that so you get more into the coniferous uplands there. And so floristically, we're looking at sagebrush scrub, and then topographically, the Great Basin is described as having no outlet to the ocean. So you do have these isolated ranges that the snow melts off into these basins that don't lead to the ocean. And the Adobe Valley flora is predominantly Great Basin. 97% of the taxa that I documented here were considered Great Basin plants. And 60% of them were also considered Mojave, and 60% of them were also Sierran. So there were those three influences of floristic provinces. And floristic inventories are a great deal of physical work and organizational work. So for this project, I spent 59 days in the field, and I collected 1,525 herbarium specimens. I wanted to voucher every taxon at each vegetation type to get a good sampling of every natural community. And the total taxa documented was 397. There's not very much of an elevation difference between the valley floors at 6,200 and the highest peak at 8,000. So we didn't see a lot of diversity, and you never got up to alpine or anything. And 26 of these plants that I documented were of conservation concern by the California Native Plant Society, which from here on out I'm going to call CNPS. So if you look at this map, the white circles are where botanists had previously collected historically collected specimens. And so there was an average of about 1 specimen per square mile. So that's not very many, especially in California. And almost half of these were around this area here where there's a lake called Black Lake there, which is a perennial lake. A lot of the water in Adobe Valley dries out in the summer, but Black Lake stays a lake all year. And there's also a road going down there, so it's easier access there, and it's managed by the Eastern Sierra Land Trust, so there is access to the lake, and lots of collections around there, but very few in the rest of the valley. There's also a road here to River Springs, so there have been some collections along that road, and then this road here is a highway, so also some collections. And so I really targeted the areas that didn't have very many collections. These blue dots are the collections I made, and a lot of the time a blue dot will represent more than one specimen because I often collected a lot of specimens in one place. So it is a lot of work, it's a lot of physical work. And there's me making a herbarium specimen and taking field notes. Adobe Valley is northern Paiute land, ancestral land, and the Benton Paiute Reservation is 3 miles to the east of the study site. The Benton Paiute name for themselves translates to hot water place people because there are hot springs there. And so people have been using this valley and studying the plants and eating the plants for up to 10,000 years, with permanent settlements beginning around 2,500 years ago. And so when I say it's a botanical black hole, I'm just referring to herbarium specimens that will be kept in museums. But there's rice grass, currants, bulbs, wild rye, wildlife food sources, and I did see people collecting pinyon seeds when I was out there. There are also 2 really important obsidian deposits nearby. Glass Mountain, which is a very prolific obsidian deposit, is just west of the study area, and then Truman Meadows, which is very high quality obsidian deposit. So there are arrowheads of both obsidian types throughout the valley. And the climate here is Great Basin climate, so cold desert shrubland. It's the only cold desert that we have in California. And it is impacted by the Sierra Nevada in terms of rainfall. So an average of 7.5 inches in Adobe Valley of rainfall and 13 inches of snowfall. And my first year out there, I had an above average rainfall, like 7 times normal. And then my second year, I had a below average, a drought year. So I got to kind of compare what the plants look like in a good and a bad rain year. So there are hot, dry summers and cold winters in Adobe Valley. So that made my collecting season between April, most of those 59 days were between April to the beginning of July. And then it got really hot and the plants got really crispy. And the winters, the road was actually closed. And when you're collecting botanical specimens, you want to collect them with fruit and flower, not only so that you're able to identify them correctly, but that botanists down the road can also look at them and identify them correctly. So I really targeted those spring months with returns in around October. All right, so now we're going to go on a field trip to Adobe Valley, and I'll talk about some of the plant communities and some of the conservation concerns that came up in those vegetation types. So here's me driving in my Subaru down the Subaru that only lasted the duration of this project down into the valley. And the first vegetation type I'm going to talk about is not actually a vegetation type. It's these granitic boulders that didn't really conform to one vegetation type because there were all kinds of shrubs and plants there. As you can see, there are all these little crevices for plants to hide in, and it did push my rock climbing skills to collect in this area. So 2 plants that were cool here was this Allium atrorubens cristatum, so Great Basin onion. Speaking of edible plants in the area. And this number after the plant name, this 4.3, that is the CNPS rare plant ranking. So I'll use those after plant names throughout the talk. And 4 just means that it's uncommon in California, and 3 means it's not very at risk either. It's not very endangered. So it's just an uncommon onion. And then this Lewisia was so cool because if you know Lewisias, they bloom after, they don't have any leaves left by the time they bloom. So they were just these bright stars throughout the granite. And just to point out, this type of rock only exists in this very southern part of the study area. So these Mesozoic granitic rocks, and the rest of the hills are these volcanic flows, and then the valley floor are alluvium deposits. So one cool plant that I found in this area, and I'm really grateful that Naomi was here when I found this plant because she's very good at spotting new belly plants. And this plant is about 1/2 inch tall. And it was also on a day where we were maybe making 100 collections because it was after the rain. And this is Nemocletus rigidus. So this is a thread plant in the Campanulaceae. And I did not get a good photo of this plant because I was there on a day when there was so much in bloom. So luckily Jim Moorfield provided me with this photo. And Naomi was right, this was a really cool plant. This is actually a very robust thread plant. And it's only been collected in California three times before this collection. As you can see though, it doesn't have a CNPS ranking. And that's partially probably because we don't know how rare it is. It's tiny and it only comes out after rain. It's incredibly ephemeral. So there could be a lot more Nemocletus rigidus out there. But the last time it had been documented was by Annie Alexander and Louise Kellogg 80 years prior. And just to hone in on the importance of botanical collecting and herbarium specimens, I was able to have this strange plant and look at their specimens and confirm, oh yeah, this plant has been documented in California before. And a little bit about who they were. Annie Alexander founded the Museum of Vertebrate Zoology at Berkeley, and she was a prolific collector, one of the most important grizzly bear collections from Alaska, and 1,500 fossils. And she got into plants a little bit later in life with her partner Louise, and they collected 17,000 specimens and have 30 taxa named after them. So they were incredible collectors, and it really helps this generation of botanists have some good baseline data for plant distribution to have collectors of the past like that. And then the rest.
Sophie, I'm sorry, I had a question on that Nemocletus rigidus.
Yeah.
Was it known in Mono County before, or where in California had it been collected?
It had been collected in the Sweetwater Mountains, and I am not positive if that's right. I think that is on the county north of Mono. I'm not exactly sure, actually.
But in the Great Basin region.
But it's been collected throughout the Great Basin here and there. Definitely a few more collections in Nevada. And then they collected it up in the Sweetwater Mountains. And then there was a collection further north. Yeah.
And you mentioned how it doesn't have a CNPS rare plant rank. And with those few collections, even though we don't know much about it, do you think that it should be ranked by the CNPS maybe? Or what is
yes, I do. CNPS actually has a rank for this situation, which is a 3, and those are plants that need more information to assess their rarity. So for the time being, I think it should at least be a 3 and be on our list for someone to go collect more data of that plant.
Sophie, before you move on, I have somebody asking just kind of a clarifying question about, are you removing plants, all the plants that you're counting, or is it just like the specific collections that you're removing? So
in terms of removing, in terms of making a herbarium voucher?
Yeah, they're just asking, do you remove the plants when you count them? So are there any plants that you're counting just out in the field?
Oh, yes, if there's a population of something that is interesting or rare, I'll take a census of that population, but I will document one individual, depending on how many are there, if I don't think that taking that individual will harm the population. So is that the question?
I think that's what they're asking. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I definitely. I only take vouchers when there's a healthy population, and yeah.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah. So the rest of the uplands are these pinyon juniper woodlands in Adobe Valley. And this area was kind of this open woodland with mixed shrubs and beautiful views, as you can see. And this area was very cool because there aren't very many roads there, and the roads are very bad. So a lot of the things that were documented during this study in this area were filling in a big distribution gap of about 60 miles, kind of from the slopes of the White Mountains up into the Bodie Hills. There aren't very many botanical collections in pinyon juniper. So the Salvia dorii variety, Peloso, was one of those, which this wins for the best smelling plant in the study. And one plant I wanted to point out in this area was Astragalus johannes howellii. And I am partial to legumes. I'm doing my PhD research on legumes. And that's not why I included this plant, but this plant does have a little bit to do with that, because as we were hiking out to go check on this plant, we kept being like, oh, there's a white flowering astragalus. Oh, there's another white flowering astragalus. And it kept being different species of white flowering astragalus. And then I think astragalus is often the gateway bean for desert botanists. But this definitely was for me. And finally, we got to the Astragalus johannes howellii, which is the only plant in the study area that's actually listed under the California Endangered Species Act. And it is listed as critically endangered, so it's highly likely to go extinct in the wild. This is almost the entire population range of this species. So there's also a couple in here in Bodie Hills. However, these up here are right behind a giant gold mine, and then these populations down in Long Valley are in sort of a more disturbed area with hot springs and a lot of grazing, and this is called the Long Valley milk vetch. So this population here in Adobe Hills, there's actually one here and one here. These are actually the least threatened populations, so ones that we definitely want to keep an eye on. And I would like to go back there and do more surveys of this plant, because it is adjacent to a road that as off-highway vehicles become more and more popular in the area, it's not in pristine wilderness out there. There are roads. And then the majority of the study area is this giant sagebrush sea, which actually was underwater 13,000 years ago when Mono Lake was so high and filled in Adobe Valley as well. So you can totally imagine that when you're looking out into this valley that it used to be underwater. So there's a lot of homogeneous shrubs out here. You can imagine why botanists wouldn't have collected right in the middle of that valley. I wanted to share this Aphyllon californicum new subspecies that was found during this inventory, because when you do floristic inventories, there are things that come up. There are plants that just haven't read the Jepson manual and don't fit into any known, any described species. And so this was one of those. This plant is a holoparasite, so it has no ability to produce, it doesn't have any chlorophyll. So it relies on the roots of shrubs to live. And recent research shows that diversification of this plant is very tied to the host plants. So I found this plant, and if I hadn't known what it was attached to, it would have keyed perfectly to Aphyllon californicum subspecies Fugii. However, that's a plant that attaches itself to Artemisia, and this was attached to an Ericomeria. So it was actually this whole other subspecies that is attached to Ericomeria and is throughout the Great Basin. So there's more research going going into that before this taxon is described. And as I was saying, it's incredibly boring in the sagebrush sea, but then after it rains, it's like the most exciting place you can imagine. So the valley really fills in with this carpet of annuals. And here are some annuals that I only saw the first year when I had a good rain year. This is Eatonella nevea. This is a monotypic genus. So there's just one species in this genus, and it's really canescent, cushiony plant, very cool with little composite flowers in the axils. And then Linanthus inyoensis, which here's a dime for scale, is this tiny Linanthus that covered the floor. And I think that this plant we decided was the culprit for this horrible sweet smell, that if you smell the plant itself, it doesn't have any odor, but after walking on these tiny annuals bunch, and even like if you drive off road and you run some over, it creates this really almost like burnt caramel smell. And so the difference between my field collecting in 2017 and 2018 was about 30% difference in diversity, because hardly any of the annuals came out the second year. So here's just showing that 30% of the plants documented were annual, and about 36 were perennials, and 12% shrubs.
Sophie, I remember that Linanthus inyoensis smell. It was pretty, I think, yeah, I've never seen anything so abundant that I've smelt plants in great abundance that cause sweet and pleasant smell, but that was the first time I had smelled something that I wasn't sure if I liked it or not.
Yeah, it has a really, I don't know, uncomfortable smell. It's like too sweet and almost burnt smelling. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was a weird one. So here in the northeastern part of the valley are these sand dunes. So winds come mostly from the west and have been depositing sand in this area. And sand dunes are pretty endangered in general in Eastern California because of recreation. They're really popular for off-highway vehicles. However, these sand dunes, well, one, I don't think you get very much air off of them. They're pretty low to the ground. And then also they have these giant shrubs protecting them. And this is a cool plant that was only found in the sand dunes, Cymopteris globosus. There are a few other collections of it in California. And it always has this sort of flopped over inflorescence, really, really cute plant. And it's always in sandy areas. So Mary D. Decker, who I wanted to bring up because this is a talk on conservation, and I think she bridges the world of being a botanist and a great conservationist in this area. She originally documented these big, giant asteraceous shrubs, Tetradimia tetramires, out here on these sand dunes. And since then, I've actually found those in kind of all the sandy areas of Adobe Valley. So they're a lot more common throughout the area than we originally thought. And Mary D. Decker was the authority of the plants of Eastern California, and she also defended sand dunes, especially the Eureka dunes. Like Annie Alexander, who had collected that Nemocladus almost right before her 80th birthday, Mary D. Decker lived to be 100 and spent a lot of time in the field as well. And when asked what she wanted to be remembered for, she said, "What would mean more to me than anything else is that I've made some inroad in protecting Owens Valley and the water situation. When I become involved, I intend to see it through." And I wanted to share that quote, one, because we're going to shift gears and talk about the water situation in Adobe Valley and in Owens Valley. And also because I thought that that was kind of a good way to view being a biologist and also being a conservationist. So especially now, I'm a botanist. I would love to be like what Mary's doing in this picture, spending all my time in the desert identifying plants, but we're also the ones that know these plants well and spend time with these plants. And it is our responsibility to make sure at least we are speaking out about what we're finding.
Yeah, so that's a really inspiring quote by Mary. I was wondering, before you shift to the freshwater habitats, you showed a great diversity of these sort of drier upland habitats. Is that something that you were expecting when you initiated your study, that you would find such great, all these different kinds of habitats? Or were you expecting it all to be kind of sagebrush-y?
Yeah, well, that is really interesting, because the most diverse area was definitely the Benton, the granitic outcrops, and that area, those outcrops covered less than 1% of the whole study area, but 30% of the diversity was found there, and 20% of the diversity was just found there. So I think one thing when throughout this flora, I realized that looking for tiny patterns, looking at satellite imagery, looking at geologic maps, it really got me thinking about where there might be pockets of diversity, even in these huge homogeneous landscapes. So, yeah.
Oh, that's really cool. And then we also have a question related to these upland habitats. And Judy wanted to know if the bitterbrush is closely associated with the sagebrush and the way it is in the Great Basin Desert in North and East Nevada.
Yes, so the bitterbrush, which is Persea tridentata, there's definitely bitterbrush mixed in throughout the sagebrush. There were areas where there was even less sagebrush and more bitterbrush and Cercocarpus, the mountain mahogany. Yeah, but the shrub composition changed a lot at different aspects. There were areas where Ephedra nevadensis was the common dominant shrub and had a little bit of Persea tridentata of the bitterbrush mixed in too. But yeah. And also that's more in the upland. So in the valley floor, the big basin sagebrush is found with rabbit brushes. So Chrysothemis fascitiflorus and Ericomeria nauseosa. And then what I'm going to talk about now is more the alkali and wetland habitats. And so those have a totally almost no overlap with the sagebrush scrub and uplands. They're kind of their own endemic flora. So at the center of the study area was this big freshwater marsh, and this is called River Spring. And if you sat here, you could watch the water sort of bubble up. And this was a very important place for wildlife. As we know, water is incredibly important for life, and even more so in the desert. And so there were mountain lion, pronghorn, Rocky Mountain mule deer here. There are pygmy rabbits nearby here that need water to sort of keep their dens from crumbling, kind of like a sandcastle, making a sandcastle. And then they're also introduced Amargosa pupfish, which is a rare desert fish, and Wong springtail, which also only occur in wetlands throughout Death Valley. So this area was really cool. And it also had this band of riparian habitat around it, but it was being severely trampled. So there's grazing in the area, and there's also a herd of above 300 horses now. And these horses, there was a management plan in place for them in the valley over, but recently they've moved and now they live in Adobe Valley. And although the important nesting areas and important springs are fenced off from the horses, that also makes a barrier for other animals, obviously, but the horses are still there. And it's kind of a difficult conservation issue because Some people see them as wild Mustangs and want to ride around and take photos with them. And some people see them as feral horses and see the damage that they're doing on the vegetation. So it's kind of a debated topic. And just for perspective, this peak here that we're looking at is Boundary Peak, which is the tallest mountain in Nevada. So we're right on the border there. And then moving farther away from the water source, and we get into these alkaline meadows, which in a good rain year, this will fill up with water and be an ephemeral lake. And then throughout the summer, it will dry out and evaporate and become this huge alkali flat. And so doing field work out there is, as you can imagine, very bright. And also if you talk while you're out there, you get this really weird taste in your mouth. So you're gonna wanna wear a mask if you go out there. And they're really interesting plants that are completely covered in white crust. But then if you look closely, there are these really awesome alkali endemics. Here's a Sphaeromeria punctoides and Ivesea kingii, which has these mouse tail-like leaves. And almost all of the plants found on these alkaline meadows are rare to California plants. So this is a rare ecosystem in California. And then between the freshwater marshes and the alkali flats are these alkaline marshes, which are also considered imperiled and very threatened ecosystems in California. And I put this Cirsium scariosum congdonii photo because this is actually my least favorite plant to collect. So because it was this sort of like sessile big urchin thing that was cut very, very pokey and also very hard to make a herbarium sheet of without it getting moldy. So you did have to get in there and sort of tear it apart neatly so that it was still beautiful, but you would get super poked. And then, so here we see this giant iris bloom here. And these alkali marshes are where we have our endemic to California taxa. Kind of on the margins between the alkali meadows and the alkali marshes are the two plants that only occur in California that are found in Adobe Valley. And those are Plagiobothris parishii, which is a popcorn flower, and in the Boraginaceae, and Calochortus inuensis. So now I'm going to talk about Calochortus inuensis, because this was a plant that I got really interested in, especially through a conservation planning course at California Botanic Garden that was taught by Naomi and Lorraine Washburn, where you choose a rare plant and sort of go deeper into the biology and ecology and the threats of the plant, and eventually publish a conservation plan, which the plan for this Calochortus excavatus is in press now. So if you don't know the genus Calochortus, well, firstly, if you don't know the genus Calochortus and are in California, you'll probably want to start a life list of Calochortus because they're very charismatic and all throughout the state. They're perennial bulbs, and they're also an important food source, although half of them are rare, so I wouldn't recommend eating them now. Even the rare one that I'm going to talk about was an important food source before it was severely threatened. And they have these diverse floral forms. You can have these cat's ear that are covered in these cool glandular hairs, and then also this fairy lantern floral form. Throughout the West and into Central America, there are 73 species. And they're known for having these very limited geographic ranges. They have heavy seeds and are not easy to disperse. And they're also very adapted to local conditions. And whether that's a substrate like we have in California, quite a few Calochortus that are adapted to serpentine. So half of the Californian taxa of the 40 we have here are rare or threatened. And then Calochortus excavatus, the one that occurs in Adobe Valley, is halophytic, and it's an alkali endemic. And it needs this constant moisture. So even more so than precipitation, it relies on groundwater. So it can live throughout some drought. And there, it has a suite of generalist pollinators. As you can see, there are these beautiful nectaries, and a lot of Calochortus have liquid nectar, but in this section, it's actually this solid sugar that beetles and bees are attracted to. I mean, you're in the desert and you see something like this, you're gonna go for it. And it's considered a 1B1 CNPS listed plant, which means it's endemic to California and it's endangered throughout its range, severely endangered throughout its range. So that's kind of what got me interested in this plant, is it's incredibly rare and endangered. However, there are 70 documented populations, which is not, that's a lot for a very rare plant. So whatever is threatening this plant is threatening the entirety of its habitat. So I was excited to go find this plant in Adobe Valley, and because they are perennial bulbs, they live underground until they're ready to come up. And then especially with Calochortus excavatus, because it's in these dry habitats, it kind of disintegrates right after it goes to fruit. So I knew I had this limited window, and then they also don't come up every year. And I had heard that for this population that blooms around summer solstice. And whenever you hear a bit of advice like that from a more senior botanist, you want to use it. And so on summer solstice, I went out with my field assistant here, Rachel Slaughter, who is my friend and has come in the field with me a lot. And we were looking around in the shrubs and we saw 1 or 2 plants kind of poking out of the shrubs. And then we realized once we had the search image for this plant that it was really everywhere. So it was a huge population of Calochortus in the north end of Black Lake, which is the lake managed by Eastern Sierra Land Trust. So I felt good about this population being here on this land trust land. But looming in the background there, we do know that Los Angeles actually owns 2 of the springs that are feeding that are connected to the water here. So we're 300 miles north of Los Angeles in this valley. So that kind of also got me thinking, all right, I know about the LA aqueduct, but this is quite far from the aqueduct. And so what is LA doing 300 miles away from the city? And probably you know the story of the LA aqueduct, but I'm going to go over a few key points. LA does own more land in Owens Valley and Eastern California than it does in Los Angeles. So these 2 areas are incredibly connected. In 1900 to the 1930s, Eaton and Mulholland bought over 1,000 farms and ranches throughout the area, and people in the area kind of thought maybe people were moving there, but they were buying this land for the water rights, and they built the aqueduct. And then by 1970, there was a second aqueduct harvesting water around Mono Basin, which is closer to the study area. And then by the 1980s, we had these severe droughts, and that's when increased groundwater pumping happened. So we had these sort of like 3 stages of water extraction from Owens Valley. In 1994, an agreement was made because the area had been so devastated that it made LA responsible for, 1, for keeping Mono Lake at a healthy lake level, and then also for restoring some of the damaged creeks and watersheds coming off of the Sierras. And then fast forward to now, to the pandemic, every spring, they look at the lake level at Mono Lake and they decide how much groundwater pumping they're going to do. And so this spring, LADWP publicly announced that Mono Lake was at a healthy level and that they were going to weaken their obligations to the agreement, and also going to pump more groundwater than they have. Well, they kind of gave a range of what they were going to pump out of Owens Valley this year. And at the high end, that would be the most they've pumped in 30 years. However, this is not a good rain year. So those numbers are not appropriate in a drought year. So a lot has been coming up since this spring around these issues. And that kind of got me back to working on the Calochortus management plan, hearing about that these issues were getting more and more severe. So Payahunadu is the Paiute name for this area, and it means land where water's flowing. And as you can see, these are the magnificent Sierras covered in snow, and then here's the Owens Valley, where the snow melts and runs south towards Los Angeles. And I do want to say that LADWP owns a lot of land there, and there is this dialogue that, oh, if LADWP didn't own this land, it would perhaps be made into housing or would be developed for humans to come and live there. And before LADWP bought this land, this was the land of flowing water. And I don't think our only two options moving forward are water extraction or housing development. There's also the option of restoring this land and keeping it the land where water flows. The two big sort of catastrophic events that came out of the aqueduct were the drying of Owens Lake, which happened 10 years after the aqueduct was built. And this was a huge inland sea, a very important stopover for birds. And after it's drying, the air in this area and also in Los Angeles, there was just so much particulate matter coming off of the shores that it was a severe health hazard. And then also Mono Lake dropping 45 feet in the 1980s. And like Owens Lake, it exposed a lot of shoreline, a lot of particulate matter was made airborne and people were breathing it in. Also, Mono Lake has the biggest California gull nesting colony on an island in the lake, and coyotes were actually able to cross that on a land bridge during the lowest points of Mono Lake. So these are kind of the two catastrophes that you hear about. And I'm from Los Angeles, and water always was a topic, but you don't really think of it as this ongoing issue. You think of it as, oh, there were water wars. However, it's not getting any better. And we also have the added pressure of less snowpack in the Sierras. So the time to figure this out is now. And Los Angeles does have a plan in place for sustainable water. And so we do need to push for that. While we're pushing for that and while we're making sure we change the way we do water extraction, we can also use less water residentially. And there are a lot of resources to figure out how to use less water. The one I'm just going to mention, because this is a botanical garden talk, is changing your yard. And especially if you walk around Los Angeles, you see that not everyone is on board with water use. And I have a native plant garden here that we've watered a couple times this year. Naomi has an amazing native plant garden that she hasn't watered at all. And it's just incredible, the birds that come, the bees that, the pollinators that come, and yeah, so changing how you use your outdoor water use makes a huge deal with your overall water consumption. Also not using water to clean the street and things like that. So we really have to change the way we think about water in Los Angeles. Okay, so now back to the plants. Now that you know that this area is owned by Los Angeles, you can see that this population that I visited in Adobe Valley is quite isolated from the rest of the populations. And that kind of goes back to the idea of documenting what a intact alkali meadow looks like, including the Calochortus populations up there. So I was able to get a good idea of the associate taxa and what the habitat looks like. For all the other recorded populations, which is 70, they're either fluctuating or unknown demographic trends. So we really need to collect baseline data on this plant to know how many plants are out there, how many populations are still there that they're not covered by a construction site, and update the occurrence data for this plant. A lot of these populations have also been only seen once. So going back to those populations is a priority. 59 of 70 populations are on LADWP land. And those are all the production wells and well fields that LADWP has in the area. So this is Amy Patton, who's the California native plant rare plant botanist. And I got her involved with this project because 70 populations is a very overwhelming number to visit on your own. And Amy runs the rare plant treasure hunts for California Native Plant Society. And they are a great community science opportunity. If you want to be trained as a rare plant scouter, you can update occurrence data that will go to the California Natural Diversity Database and let us have a better understanding of how rare plants are doing in California statewide. And you can also specifically help with this Calochortus project. If you email her, we have our own sort of training for, even if the plants are there, how to assess the habitat and contribute to this project. So Amy and I did some follow-up searches for Calochortus along the aqueduct. This population here, I would call mixed use, and I don't think there's any room for Calochortus there, but all data is good data, and now we know what this population actually looks like on the ground. So I'm just gonna end with a picture of this Owens Valley checker bloom, the Sidalcia covillii, which is another alkali endemic plant. And even when you don't find the plant you're looking for, and even when your project is sort of about one species, like conserving this one species, it is in turn conserving the habitat for a bunch of other alkali endemic plants. And this one has even a more narrow distribution than the Calochortus. And so in conclusion, when we do this kind of work, these floristic inventories and rare plant surveys and systematic studies, they all inform our conservation action. And we can't really make effective conservation decisions without knowing what's out there in the landscape. But then also when we do work on conservation of species and habitats, a lot of other elements get brought in, and we do have to examine the way that we do things as society, which is healthy to do. It's an important process. And yeah, so thank you so much. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Sophie. That was wonderful. So yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to write them in the chat or in the Q&A. I do see one question here that from Ted is asking, he sees a place called Pizzona. It's shown on the map, I think maybe in your second or third to last slide. Do you by chance know what that is?
Yes, Pizzona is an old homestead in the area. So I'm not sure when they built it. Right now, it's just basically a kind of like a remnant. There's like a rock wall and sort of like a relic of a building, but there's not any actual infrastructure there anymore. But but it is there. Oh, also
there was water there, right?
Yeah, it is next to a spring, Pizzona Spring. There's 2 springs there, and so that's probably why they chose that area to homestead in the hills. And there was one other structure in Adobe Valley, which was an old stagecoach that was still standing right next to River Spring. So, you know, where there's water, there's going to be development. It's the same thing with the aqueduct. You know, where there's water, they're going to develop. Yeah.
Right. Totally. That's interesting. Very interesting. We have another question is, do you need any special permission from LADWP to make plant observations there?
That's a good question. So to collect plants on LADWP land, I got special permission. And so I had a window to do that within Adobe Valley. But it's LADWP land throughout Owens Valley. There are recreational areas that are owned by LADWP. And so you don't actually need permission to go onto a lot of the land. That's another thing that we're kind of figuring out with this Calochortus work, is what is accessible and what isn't, and where are we going to need permission to enter. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh, go ahead, Naomi.
There's a question about creosote, if creosote bush occurs in Adobe Valley. And then did you find any interesting disjunctions for any of the taxa that you found, things that were kind of way out of range?
Okay, so creosote does not occur in Adobe Valley. Adobe Valley gets freezing cold in the winter. And so that kind of is the difference between the desert floristic province and the Great Basin floristic province. We're higher elevation and it gets really cold. And so creosote wouldn't be able to survive there. In terms of disjunctions, let me think. I'm trying to think if something comes up. I mean, that Nemocladus was fairly disjunct. There wasn't anything that was unbelievably disjunct that I can think of right now.
So you had that day where you found all those astragalus with the Astragalus Ioannis howellii. Was Astragalus a particularly species-rich genus in your study area? And do you remember?
Astragalus, there were 9 species of Astragalus in my study area. So the most diverse genus was Eriogonum by far. I think there were like 15 or something, but Astragalus was definitely up there. There are also quite a few carex in the wetlands. And the most diverse families were Asteraceae by far. I think there are over 70 Asteraceous things. Mm-hmm.
I have just kind of a funny question. Is somebody had a class at Cal State University LA in the early 70s with Professor Winitsky. Do you have any relation to somebody who was a professor there?
At Cal State LA?
Yeah.
No.
Okay.
I'm the well, I shouldn't say that. No, that is not related to me.
Okay.
Definitively. Yeah. But I am from Los Angeles.
Dylan Neubauer notes the pokiness of Cirsium scarius and variety Condonia is definitely something that's very pleasant.
Yeah, yes, definitely.
But there's also a question of, have you found Calochortus excavatus in the White Mountains? In particular, would it occur in the ancient Bristlecone pine forest?
I haven't found it in the White Mountains. There is one locality that's kind of heading up towards the White Mountains out of Big Pine, but definitely, I would be very surprised to find it at that elevation. So the alkali meadows and marshes are mostly on the toe slopes of the mountains, and the bristlecones are way up there. So I would be very surprised. There's also quite a few Calochortus lookalikes. There's Calochortus bruneus, which also looks like Calochortus excavatus, but would be higher up. And how you can tell the difference is Calochortus excavatus has these very long red anthers and those big purple glands. But if you see a Calochortus excavatus up there, please let me know.
Well, I think that was our last question. Sophie, thank you so much for such a wonderful talk. And Naomi, thank you for leading this discussion tonight. I really appreciate you both being here. It's such a great thing that we can share with such a large geographic lecture hall that we had tonight. So thank you both for being here. It was really great.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. And also thank you. This is my thank you slide to everyone all the groups that funded this research, and then also everyone who helped me with fieldwork, a lot of the people I know, and all the botanists involved in the project too. So thank you.
Thank you. So if you know somebody who wasn't able to attend tonight, I just want to point out that this presentation is recorded and we do post them up on our website, which is calbg.org, on the digital content page there. So if you had to step away for a moment, or you know somebody who wasn't able to attend, you can find that there. And then I also just want to share one last time that next month on November 17th, Maria Jesus will be discussing the conglomerate mesa with us, and Naomi once again will be moderating the evening. So we look forward to having you all join us next month. And so with that, I just want to say thank you to everyone, and thank you, Naomi, and thank you, Sophie.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, everyone.